Dr. Amihan April Melia Alcazar, or April, is the current university president of the University of Urdaneta City, Metro Manila, Philippines, with as many as 16,000 students. She is a Fulbright Senior Scholar on a research fellowship at the University of Tennessee, Martin for academic year 2020-2021. She has a doctorate in business administration and a master's in business administration, both from Tohoku University, Japan's premier science state university, where she was a scholar of the Japanese Ministry of Education for 6 years. She was also an Association of Overseas Technical Scholar for Intellectual Property at the Japan Patent Office and an Asian Scholar of the Japan Association of Language Teachers. April graduated with her Bachelor of Laws degree and Bachelor in Business Administration degree cum laude from the University of the Philippines, where she was a member of the Pi Kappa Pi and Pi Gamma Mu Honor Societies, and a university and college scholar. She is a member of the Philippine Bar since 1996 to the present. She undertook her international dual tech traineeship under the auspices of the International Association of Students in Business and Economics at the University of Bayreuth, Bavaria, Germany, for 2 years. She is married to fellow lawyer Richard since 2002 and is mother to Lara Aiko, a 17-year-old gifted child, and Linda Keiko, a 16-year-old who is on the spectrum. So for today, Dr. Alcazar will give her insights as a parent of 2 children who have 2 very distinct educational journeys. I'd like you all to welcome Dr. April Mihan Alcazar.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be joining your last class for the early childhood development. I had the pleasure of also having lectured the class, I think, last academic year. And so, again, it is a pleasure for me to be able to share my own experiences, first as a parent, to 2 very distinct, different children, and then maybe from the perspective of an educator and how that actually fitted into my eventual professional growth and development. So I did not begin my career as an educator. So it's actually been providential for me that I eventually ended up in the field of education. So as mentioned in my background, I really trained myself to be a professional legal practitioner, and specifically in the field of international corporate or business law. But eventually, when I married and decided to have a family, even before I had my children, so I had thought that in order to achieve more life-work balance, and to also give into like my more intellectually oriented perspective, I thought that it would be good for me to eventually involve myself in education, but specifically in higher education. So I actually prepared myself to join the higher education sector, and which is why I undertook my master's and my doctorate degree. So little did I eventually know that through this process, it will be very beneficial, of course, eventually to me on a personal and not only on a professional level. So when I had my first child, I was already 35 years old. That in itself is not really, I think, too late to have children. And the second child I had when I was 36 years old. So regardless of what physiological factors may have come into play, so both of them had very distinct physiological and eventually, of course, learning challenges to begin with. So I think now we can try to see, so just be showing graphically like my own children and how they've progressed through the years. So at the first instance, so we have here Lara Aiko. So she was born in 2004. And so first slide I just like to show to you is the framework by which we can discuss with respect to how the spectrum of learning can be viewed from the perspective of different learners with different paces of development. So, of course, if you're looking at autism spectrum disorder, you're actually looking at learning regression, meaning for every chronological year of a child's development, you will only have a fraction that could be developed in almost all aspects of their development. So that's why there is either stunt or delay in the growth or even a regression. So without proper intervention, it could be that what they would have learned would eventually also regress. And then the other spectrum, of course, if you have the high functioning learners, then in addition to what is expected in terms of the chronological, each chronological year, then you will also be developing higher learning, meaning if one is only a fraction, let's say 25% of what it should be in each chronological year, then on the other spectrum, you may have like 125% of the learning, the other end of the spectrum. And so this framework would provide you some features of what actually happens when you're doing the spectrum of learning. So naturally, you begin with like the standard. And so, you know, like 5, if you had a Likert scale, for example, that is what would be actually like the standard learning. And then eventually you will go through like whether on the other end of the spectrum, you have good learning, you have poor learning, and then of course the absence of poor acquisition of learning. And eventually, of course, on the other end, you will have excellent learning level of learning, which is well beyond that of the average. So that is kind of like the framework by which we will try to analyze the physiological, mental, emotional, social, and of course the different types of learnings, the multiple intelligences that children actually learn. Okay, so let's get to the first slide. The next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So in the leftmost corner, so that would be Lara Aiko. So she was born in 2004. And this is a picture of her when she was like 3 months old. So as you can see, even from her demeanor, it seems that she's very alert in this photo. And so I would say like even, so I took the photos of how they were at the same age level. So also the 3 months. So she seems like very alert here. So even before the age of 1 year old, she could not yet articulate in terms of like language, but she had more active gestures or action oriented behavior, so that you may get clues from her as to what she might want or desire to do. And then eventually, by the time she was 2 years old, she already had a full vocabulary, as you would a 5 or a 6 year old. So the pace of learning for languages was very fast for her. And then eventually, to also teach her, she could pick up very quickly concepts, and through observation, she was also able, I think, to grasp many of the behaviors of people from around her. So one of the most distinctive incidents that I remember when she was 1 year old was she was wearing her socks because it was cold. but she didn't really like wearing socks. And so she would actually really take them off. And I would try to put it back, and she would take it off again. And so it would be like a cat and mouse game for us. But it seemed like she knew exactly what she was testing. She was testing me as to whether I would give in to what she actually wanted, because without actually the language to communicate it, I could see from her facial expressions, her creative behavior, that she actually wanted to get what she wanted, but she was wanting to see whether I would behave in a negative manner to what she was doing. So I thought that that was a very, very good expression of how she could grasp the concept, maybe of like whether there was reward or punishment to her behavior, or how her behavior would be reacted to by others. So in the next photo, we have Linda Keiko. She was born in 2006. So there was only a 1 year and 3 months difference between the two of them. And again, it's the same age. She was also 3 months old in this photo. So as you can see, she's lying prone. What I've noted from her behavior was that from the time that she was born, she was very quiet. So we did not know yet at the time the diagnosis. So it's not apparent the autism spectrum disorder at birth, because physiologically everything was there was no problem from prenatal to the postnatal. Physiologically, there was no indication from medical diagnosis that there was any problem. But then we noted that if we called her name, so one, Lara Aiko, we called I, and Linda Keiko, we called K. So I and K, right? So, and if we called her, there was no response whatsoever. So, even if you called her incessantly, there would be no response to her name as compared to Lara Aiko. So, that was kind of like, to us, a little bit not yet alarming at the time, at 3 months old, but kind of a difference in the indication in terms of the behavior already. So she was very quiet. She had no articulated sounds at this time of 3 months old, and spent most of her time sleeping. Of course, at this age, like 3 months old, most infants would actually spend a lot of their time sleeping. So we did not yet think that there was anything aberrant yet at that point in terms of the behavior. Then you can see that here, there's the two of them. They're playing with water. So it's summer, as children are very much fun loving, right? So Lara Aiko always had the tendency to teach Linda Keiko things. And so here she was teaching like how to scoop water on their heads, over their heads, right? So, and there was a natural affinity between the two of them. Maybe it's like the closeness of their age gap. But then I noted also that if I scolded or raised my voice to Aiko, the eldest one, because she's the one that I could actually speak to, and I knew that she could understand. And usually she's the one with the sort of mischievous behavior, as I've mentioned, right? She was always wanting to do things her own way. And sometimes I would raise my voice against her. Keiko would actually be crying, even though I was not speaking to her. So it seemed that she had a very emotive behavior, and that close affinity to her sister. So that's how it was prior to the time that they were like 1 year old, because it was at the time when they were both 1 year old that a kind of diagnosis had to be taken, because the behavior started to be not just of an average infant or child at the age at 1 year old. Okay, next slide, please. So here, sorry, I think let's get back to the other one. So as I've mentioned in the first slide, so at the time, at 1 year old, both of them were diagnosed at around the same time. So in the case of Lara Aiko, she went through different kinds of like testings for learning abilities, and so it was determined by the education psychologist that it was recommended that she go to actual preschool at the time that she was 2 years old, not necessarily to learn about what the subject matters were, but really more to have developed social behavior, because she had the tendency to be very have this bullying behavior, meaning because she was very active, then that needed to be addressed on how she would deal with children of her own age. So she went to preschool at 2 years old. On the other hand, Keiko, when she was 1 year old, so we went through a battery of physiological and also learning abilities tests to a limited extent, in order to eliminate the possibilities of other conditions that she may have, like did she have a learning disability, did she have a hearing deficiency, was it also an eye deficiency, and so on. So in order for us to eventually come up with the diagnosis that she had autism spectrum disorder. So from that time on, there was a divergence in terms of like the educational needs that needed to be addressed for both. As I mentioned, Lara Aiko, she was recommended to go to preschool at 2 years old, while Keiko was recommended to undergo a series of different therapies in order to address autism spectrum disorder. So you had occupational therapy, applied behavior therapy, and speech therapy was also a part of that, because she was not yet in a position to articulate. So we started the therapies since she was 1 year and 3 months old. Okay. And then eventually, so here, this is around midpoint, 7 years old. So normally you would have a difference between 0 to 7, and then from 8 years old until 10 years old. So here, this is when they are between 7 and 8 years old at this time. So as you can see from Lara's demeanor, even disposition, she seemed to be almost like preteens or tweens in her behavior here, even though she was just between 7 and 8 years old, because every year they would undergo an education psychological evaluation so that an individual education plan can be prepared for them. So this is as if you're preparing a curriculum for each child that will be followed eventually to address their educational needs. So the recommendation was for either one of them to go to a regular school and then make provisions for their particular needs. So in the case of Lara Aiko, it's the enrichment and enhancement activities over and above that of the regular classes, because she would easily get bored with the regular classes. So that provisions needed to be made for other tutors to enrich and enhance, let's say, her math levels, her science levels, as well as her language levels, and to have other interests in music. And she was also interested in martial arts, for example, to address those multiple intelligences to develop her skills. On the other hand, for Keiko, as you can see, like even at 7 years old, so just very much like beginning towards like motor skills. You can see her like being taught to feed herself, but this is already between 7 to 8 years old. Normally, it would be between 2 to 3 years old when you're developing like these motor skills for self-feeding, for example. And again, as I mentioned, the gap between the two. So as the chronological ages would actually widen the disparity. So if you counted from the time Keiko was like 0 to 7, and you estimated that there would just be a 25% average growth for each chronological age by the time you get to 8 years old. So it would be as if you would only have a fourth or between 2 to 3 years old development for Keiko. Whereas for Aiko, if again you estimated that the growth was 125% per chronological year by the time she would be 8 years old, then it would be as if she would be 11 or 12 years old already in terms of like development. So the disparity between them, of course, will widen as they grow older. So there's a natural progression here of Aiko being able to understand further the needs for Keiko to be taught. And this is like also, I'm sure you've discussed about like peer teaching in a way because of their bond as sisters and because of the closeness that they would have within the family unit. So let's go to the next slide. So the next slide is the time when Keiko graduated from elementary school. So this would be at the time when Keiko would be 11 years old when she finished her elementary, almost 12 years old. So, and then Aiko would be between 12 to 13 years old. But as you can see from both their demeanor and disposition, it's as if Aiko is almost like a 17 or 18-year-old here. From the way she's behaving and the way she looks, right? Whereas Keiko here, even though she is generally of the same height and is even bigger than Aiko, so she just finished her elementary grade here, but she probably would exhibit the behavior of an 8-year-old to 9-year-old during this time. So the therapy was undertaken continuously, as I've mentioned, from the time she was 1 and 3 years old. And the one feature that we had from the schools that we actually registered them in is that it is actually a progressive school, meaning for children with special needs, like in Keiko's case, there would be a shadow teacher who was allowed to enter the classroom in addition to the regular teacher, the subject matter teacher, or the homeroom teacher who would be in the classroom in order for the shadow teacher, who is actually a special education teacher, to simplify the curricula or the lesson that was being given to Keiko. So she attended the elementary school regularly. One of the main reasons would be, of course, to mirror the behavior, the social behavior of regular children, so that she would exhibit also that kind of regular behavior. And even though she had like the mental, she had the deficiency in mental development, through this progressive school, it was possible to be promoted to the next level through the completion of modules that were given to her and specifically tailored based on the individual education plan that was provided to her. These are like very special features. And maybe one of the reasons why we were able to utilize this approach is because even before I had my own children and my family, my mother, who was also not an educator to begin with, but eventually went into education, was the chairman of board of trustees of a school for special children. But the typology of education that was, I think, advocated for like from 30 to 35 years ago was to actually segregate the special needs children and be educated among them, being only special needs children, to be segregated from the regular children. And one of the researches and the behavior that was actually observed is that there is a tendency to reinforce this special behavior that is exhibited by special needs children if they end up in an environment with only special needs children also being educated, in comparison to a regular school, which is progressive, that allows a special child to a limited number of special children to enter the regular classroom and be educated in the same manner with the same social or learning environment as regular children. So that was the approach that we wanted to take in terms of the education for them. One, for Aiko to actually be with children of the same chronological age in order to mirror that social behavior, the same as Keiko also, but then to address their specific educational needs, one through enrichment and enhancement activities or classes, and on the other hand you will have provisions for shadow teacher and provisions for addressing deficiencies in learning abilities in the case of Keiko. Next slide, please. So now we come to when they're already, I'm sorry, 15 years old, right? So they've gone to high school by this time, and they've finished the first 3 years, which is like junior high school or middle school already. So like Aiko, as you can see, she's like already a very, I think, typical uh, 18 to 19-year-old. She has her pets. She has a club that she belongs to where they do the taking care of pets and walking together with her friends and socializing. And then Keiko, okay, in the meantime, has also developed several physiological concerns when she went to high school. One was that she had the difficulty adjusting to the lengthened time of stay in school, because in elementary she only stayed in school for half a day and was always able to return home during lunchtime onward. In high school, of course, the hours of stay in school are lengthened, so she had difficulty with that. And then eventually, she had seizure disorder, which is brought about by hormonal changes with the onset of menstruation. So we had to, in fact, during that first year when she was diagnosed with seizure disorder, we had to stop schooling altogether for around 2 to 3 months at first, and then eventually only for a limited period of time, meaning like she would only go to school for like twice a week, for example, first to really address the physiological problem. And then secondly, she also developed diabetes, not because there was a problem with the diet, but it was because her pancreas could not really produce. So, in addition to psychological or mental disabilities, there's also often some physiological problems that may develop, and part of that is the inability to produce insulin based on like the requirements of your metabolism for the body. So there was like a 4-year period when this physiological problem of diabetes had to be addressed through insulin being given to Keiko. And so here, there's like sugar monitoring. As you can see, like she's doing sugar monitoring. Of course, somebody else actually does the sugar monitoring. But through observation, she's able to see like, okay, how are the devices being actually administered on her, because blood has to be taken from her before meals, and then insulin needed to be injected before every meal for her. So that was the case that happened when she turned 12, between 12 to 13. And so again, you can see the both of them. So Aiko, her behavior is really that of an 18 to 19-year-old, and Keiko in this case would be around 10 to 11, around this time, even though she would be already 15 years old in this photo. Okay. Then the next slide. So this is a very recent photo. So this is Aiko now. So she's going to be turning 18 in September. So that's a very, for us, it's a momentous occasion because then she becomes a debutante, so-called. But then based on her performance, she's around 20 to 22 to 23 years old in terms of like mental development. And Keiko here is already 16. So, but as you can see, even just from the demeanor, it would seem that of a 12-year-old from their behavior and this very recent photo that we had together. So as you can see, because of the early childhood intervention that was done in Keiko, so basically in social environment, she's able to engage with people. So she's not adverse to social engagement, even though she's not actually able to articulate much beyond certain words and phrases that are familiar to her. But then in social situations, she's very well adapted, whether it be behavior in a restaurant, for example, or at church, or let's say here at the park. And of course, in the case of Aiko, from the early childhood bullying behavior because of her higher abilities, now she's become much more empathetic to other people and probably has developed a natural affinity to become a teacher, a peer mentor to her. To those of the same chronological age because of her keen sense of behavior. So right now, Keiko is going to be entering senior high school. So that's grade 11. And she's going to go to a technical vocational livelihood school where they teach culinary arts for skills and competencies development. Whereas Aiko is in her last year in senior high school in grade 12. And she's already, in fact, been accepted to a pioneering class for health allied sciences. So because her goal is to be admitted to an accelerated Doctor of Medicine program that will allow her to finish the course in 6 years' time. So she's already in the university where that is being offered. And if all proceeds well enough this from September until October, which is when they do the admission process, then the 2 years that she would have spent in grade 11 and 12 will be considered already as pre-medicine course. And so, as I've mentioned, in that accelerated Doctor of Medicine program, it will only take 6 years for her to finish the medical course. So this is like the journey that we have undertaken as parents to our children. Of course, it was necessary for us to be able to gather the resources in order to provide them the level of education and the quality that we wanted to provide to them. But I think more than that, it's really the acceptance and the consciousness of the kind of care that children require from early childhood. So I've been an advocate for many causes, but one of the causes that I have always advocated for is that for of education. I think it's more of the education of parents on how to actually address the educational needs of their children, and that responsibility does not lie only in the educational institutions or in the teachers and the mentors. Rather, it should really be a collaboration between the home environment and that of the educational institution in order for the early childhood development to have a great impact towards the development of children. So as I always emphasize, for especially for special needs children, the early intervention is what would make the difference as to how they can eventually become developed as productive adults. Without early intervention, it's very difficult to actually catch up with what may eventually be the development of children. So I'm hoping that with your emphasis, this is rather an early childhood development class. I was informed that you will see the very pivotal and vital role that you can play in actually determining the future of the children that you will be teaching and mentoring in the future. So I hope with that sharing, many would be very much inspired. As I was informed, this is the very last day of your classes to maybe undertake more of immersive learning experience through teaching children, whether in a volunteer or really in a formal capacity, and for you to realize that education is really one of those vital needs that we have in modern life in order to become productive citizens for the future. So I wish you the best in your endeavors, a most enjoyable summer ahead. And thank you so much for your time and your invitation for today. Thank you.